The UN's Refugee Agency says it has over 20 million people under its mandate, with just 5 countries, Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan and Myanmar, accounting for 68% of all refugees globally, with key messages focused around education, highlighting the need for including refugees in national education systems for the benefit of both communities.
Inclusion is not just the broad pieces of including in education system, in health systems, is also goes through a lot of very complicated issues. Regularizing is a legal process in a country, receiving documentation, having access to bank accounts, I think it was mentioned, having connectivity. These are all less obvious aspects which actually in our daily lives we take for granted. You know, we have an ID card, we can log into internet, we have a bank account. But if you don't have these things, and they are very often difficult for refugees, there's no hope for inclusion. There's no tools for inclusion.
New conflicts like the ongoing crisis in Tigray, Ethiopia, exacerbates what is already an acute global concern, stretching humanitarian resources that could further be complicated by an impending drought and famine, at a time when the COVID pandemic remains a going concern.
International financial institutions have set up massive relief programs, safety net programs to help the economies of these countries after situations of lockdowns. So our aim has been with these institutions to say, when you design a rescue package for the economy of a poor country, and you give them hundreds of millions of dollars in loans or grants, make sure that you factor in the fact that that particular country hosts a large numbers of refugees, and they also must benefit from whatever help is given to the country.
Grande was speaking at an event co-hosted by the United States after President Joe Biden in May revised the resettlement cap for refugees in the country at 62,500, up from just 15,000 set by the previous administration.
I'm proud to say that President Biden has acted from day one to ensure the United States remains a country committed to providing safety for the most vulnerable. The president has used executive orders to rebuild and enhance the U.S. refugee admissions program and spoken about how we must stand as a beacon of liberty and refuge for the world. Del, for that introduction. As we celebrate the power of inclusion and honor refugees on June 20th, let's remember the millions of Syrians who desperately need our help. They and millions of others around the world are counting on us. They're counting on us for life-saving support. They're counting on our common humanity to extend hands in their time of vulnerability and their time of need.
86% of the world's refugees are hosted in developing countries, while up to 34 million of the 82 million people forcibly displaced are children below the age of 18. Sherman Bricepies, SABC News, New York.
The UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, says global displacements rose by 4% last year as people continued to flee wars, violence, persecution and human rights violations despite the coronavirus pandemic. Sarah Kimani reports for us.
According to this year's UN Global Trends report, 6% of refugees worldwide are hosted in developing countries. Global forced displacements have risen for 9 consecutive years, as per the report, which also indicates that today 1% of humanity is displaced, and there are twice as many forcibly displaced people than in 2011, when the total was just under 40 million. Africa hosts nearly 6.6 million refugees, 4.5 million of whom are in the East, Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes region. Uganda and Sudan each host at least 1 million refugees, with Ethiopia following closely at 800,000 people. Uganda is one of the top 5 refugee hosting countries globally. Neighboring South Sudan is the 4th highest refugee-producing country in the world, with 2.2 million South Sudanese refugees in mainly Uganda, Ethiopia, and Sudan. 6 out of the 10 highest refugee-producing countries are in Africa. The report further states that, driven by crisis, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Sudan were among the countries that registered the highest number of internally displaced persons, that is IDPs, globally, with a total of 2 million people newly displaced in 2020. The UN Refugee Agency warns that despite the ongoing coronavirus pandemic and calls for a global ceasefire, conflict continues to force people from their homes, as well as impacts of climate change, such as floods and droughts. More than 2/3 of all the people who fled abroad came from just 5 countries: Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. The report also notes that at the peak of the pandemic in 2020, over 160 countries had closed their borders, with 99 states making no exception for people seeking protection. Sarah Kimani, SABC News in Kenya.
Now, let's discuss this. We are joined via Zoom by United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, spokesperson Kate Pond. Kate, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Now, we know that today is to recognize the courage, but more importantly, just the plight of refugees. Those numbers are indeed staggering. We are reporting 82 million people displaced by the end of 2020. Speak to us about just the reason behind this high number, and also what are world leaders doing about it?
Indeed, every year this number does get higher, and each year it continues to shock us. I mean, even during the pandemic, 3 million people fled their homes. So while the rest of the world was staying at home to stay safe, 3 million people had to flee theirs in fear of their lives. So what we are calling on world leaders to do is to set aside their differences and to act together.
Now, the breakdown of these numbers and where people are actually most displaced from, it speaks to a huge issue, a more fundamental issue, and that is of the lack of peace in some of these countries, as well as a disregard for humanity. Now, the UN report says that about 60% of those that are displaced essentially come from 5 countries. Please break this down for us.
Yes, this is indeed correct, and it has been the same for a number of years. That Syria has topped the number of refugees worldwide for a number of years now. It's followed by countries like South Sudan and Myanmar and Afghanistan and Venezuela.
And in fact, if I can just quote from your report, Syria actually attributes to most of those 5 countries that you've just mentioned, with 6.7 million. Now, if we know that if some people flee one country, they go to another, which of these countries then are the ones that are receiving most of these refugees? Talk to us about the global picture, and particularly a focus on Africa, if you can.
Absolutely. Most people flee the shortest possible distance. The majority of people who are outside of their homes, who fled war and persecution, are within the same country. So for the people who have managed to leave their countries, a lot of them have gone to the country next door. Like, for example, people who are fleeing Syria are mostly in Turkey. I mean, Turkey hosts 3.7 million refugees alone. Or Lebanon, where 1 in 4 of the citizens, 1 in 4 of the people in Lebanon are actually refugees. On the continent of Africa, Uganda is actually the largest refugee hosting country on the continent, with 1.4 million refugees just in Uganda. Many of them have come from South Sudan or from DRC. Indeed, sub-Saharan Africa is actually home to more than 1.1 in 5 of all refugees the whole world over.
Now, Kate, we are in the middle of a pandemic worldwide. I can imagine the life of a refugee one who is also fleeing from a war-torn country is hard enough. Talk to us about just some of the challenges that are being faced by people who are looking for a better place to start a new life, to protect their children. What are some of the challenges that they are facing during this pandemic?
Well, you're absolutely right. COVID has disrupted every aspect of human life for everyone, everywhere. And it's been hardest for the most vulnerable in communities. Now, refugees and asylum seekers are some of the most precarious in every society. And they have lost work opportunities. Gender-based violence is rising. Children are out of school and poverty levels are rising. The socioeconomic impact of the pandemic is extremely worrying.
Now, earlier in the interview, we were talking about just, what the role of world leaders is. I mean, the question has arisen, is there a lack of political will where it comes to, countries that can actually assist those that are fleeing these war-torn countries?
I think what we see with this steady increase of numbers year on year, for 9 years in a row, the number of people displaced has risen to the point that it's now twice what it was in 2011. We need greater political will. The tools are there in the Global Compact for Refugees and also the Refugee Convention. So we have the tools and the means to do something about this. And we call on world leaders to stand together and stand with refugees.
Now, another, very upsetting, statistics that came out of your report is that 42% of, people that are forcibly removed from their homes, those that end up being displaced, are actually young children. And we're talking about children younger than 18. Talk to us about those numbers and how they are being helped.
Yeah, this is particularly concerning when you think that children are 30% of the world population, but they are 42% of the displaced population. What this means is many of them will miss out on school. They'll miss out on years of school during the process of displacement. And then when they arrive in another country, they may have to learn languages before they can return to school. So they do lose tremendous amounts of opportunities. So what we at UNHCR are doing, and particularly this year, we're trying to focus heavily on education.
And now, I'm looking at the statement, and then the saddest part about the children is that you're saying that almost 1 million children were born as refugees between 2018 and 2020, and that's probably the only life they will know. Now, when we look at some of these numbers, and we know that various countries, including this one, South Africa, is mandated to somehow provide some form of aid, to people that are destitute. Talk to me about the UN Charter and just some of the foundations and where you can then hold countries responsible that are meant to protect some of these desperate people.
The Refugee Convention, signed in 1951, enshrines people's right to asylum. It's a human right. Everybody has the right to sanctuary from conflict and persecution. Now, here in South Africa, the government actually takes their responsibility quite seriously, and refugees and asylum seekers in South Africa, they live in the community and they enjoy substantial legal protections and the right to live and work and go to school and access healthcare on a par with citizens. In fact, the only thing that a refugee in South Africa can't do that a citizen can do is vote.
Absolutely. Well, if it looks so great for South Africa, why is there such a huge disconnect between the South African public as well as government, as an example? Because, I'm sure you see service protests in the country, particularly around foreigners that live in communities where there's a huge disconnect in terms of, why they are in the country, which is tantamount to be seen as xenophobic. What are some of the reports that you are hearing on the ground? Or maybe there's a lack of education as it comes to, just that understanding of why some of these people are in the country.
You're absolutely right that over the last decade or so, there have been bouts of violence affecting foreign nationals, and that does run counter to what is fundamentally a very welcoming and inclusive set of laws and policies. Particularly recently, I think it's very important to look at the root causes of a lot of this violence. Remember that the perpetrators of this violence are some of the most vulnerable members of South African society themselves, and they too have been struggling terribly under the pandemic. Under the current circumstances, hardships are causing frustrations to bubble up, and violence has occurred.
Now, as an ordinary South African, and as we wrap this interview, watching you this afternoon, and they understand the laws that are mandated, by this country, given the UN Charter, what are some of the things that we can do on a practical level to just help educate and also protect the rights of those that are in this country seeking help?
I think the most important thing to remember is that nobody wants to be a refugee. And those that are here in South Africa are actually in a very good position, potentially, because of the integrated nature of their living. South Africans are our neighbours. They are also our doctors and our nurses. They clean our streets, they serve our food. They are the person next door to us.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much for that, Kate Pond, for your time here this afternoon. She is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, a spokesperson. As you know, our focus today is on Refugee Day. It's celebrated across the world. So we'll have more of your top stories when we come back. Stay with us.